Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to A Casual Analysis, a series where we analyze gaming trends old and new. In this video, we're going to be discussing the formation of a meta in gaming. What is the meta? How is it formed? And is it beneficial or harmful to the state of a game? Before we begin, I want to make sure that we all understand that the meta is not something a developer can consciously choose to create a game without. The only thing you can do as a developer is try to manage the positives of having a meta against the negatives of one existing in your community. So it is inevitable, but what is it exactly? Let's begin the analysis by defining the meta and what it truly means for a game to have one. For those of you who don't know what the heck I've been talking about, the meta is what gamers call the strategy to play the most efficiently or effectively as possible, depending on your goal. The meta in PvP, for example, will usually entail a build that deals the most damage or provides a certain survivability that increases the chance of you winning by the highest amount. Meaning that if two equally skilled players were to compete against each other,
Hello there.
I will eat your skull.
But one was following the meta and the other was just doing whatever he felt was fun, the game would favor the player who is competing using the meta strategy. And most likely, that player would win. The same theory applies to PvE. Depending on your role, the meta would allow DPS to pump out the most damage, the tank to live the longest, and the healer to heal the most. Of course, being compared to players who aren't using the meta strategy. If two DPS players on a raid team were the same class, level, and had the same amount of skill, but one was using the meta strategy for gear and class talents, that player would do more damage than the player who was using the gear and class talents that he found enjoyable. This sounds pretty simple, right? Just use the best weapons and the best strategy, and you will perform the best. What's the big deal? Well, you are right. It is very simple. The meta itself is not inherently a negative or complicated thing. There is no escaping a meta because it is formed from the experience or the knowledge of the players that have come before you, and they have chosen to pass a strategy on to you. The meta is short for metagaming, and is a shorthand way of saying that the strategy you are using was formed using outside knowledge of the inner workings of the game. For example, if I am playing a game for the first time at launch, with everyone else who has had little to no exposure of the game so far, it would be hard for anyone to say that they know the best strategy to win or beat the game. I am learning the game by experiencing it, just like everyone else at the time.
We got this, friends. Just have fun.
But now say that 3 months down the line, players have already been exposed to most parts of the game and have had time to refine their strategy as they become veterans.
Even side! Many whelps! Now handle it!
These are your pioneers, as they will have explored the game long enough to then share their refined strategies with new players. Once this happens, and the knowledge is then shared back with new players, the fresh blood in the game will be able to look up tutorials or guides or videos on how to best go about completing whatever goal they set out to finish. They will start the game with an amount of knowledge that the original players didn't have. This cycle then continues, as more content is explored and strategies are refined. It starts pretty simple at first, like how to use specific weapons and what class works best with them. A warrior who can use great axes and swords will have a strategy form that explains which one does more damage in which situation. A paladin who can heal or do massive amounts of damage will have a strategy guide telling you what armor to wear for each role. Eventually, the meta can be extremely specific and get very technical. It will include using certain weapon loadouts or skill builds that are scenario specific, all in the chase for 2% more damage using a specific ability. A warlock will have a strategy guide to tell them exactly what buttons to press and in what order to press them, so that they might do the most damage with the skills they currently have. And this will change, depending on if that same warlock is raiding, or taking part in PvP, or just doing some dungeons with his friends. These strategies are all formed because there have been players that have already done exactly what you were choosing to do in the game and have found the best way to complete it, as efficiently and effectively as possible. They played the game and had fun discovering that strategy and are now taking the time to impart that knowledge onto you. The meta has been around in some form or fashion for a very long time. I remember I had a copy of The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker official guide, licensed by Nintendo. I was 9 years old and I read that from cover to cover thinking, man, I don't want to miss anything in this game. The strategy guide told me exactly what to do, how to solve all of the puzzles, and beat all of the bosses. All I had to do was press the buttons at the right time. That is metagaming. Philosophically speaking, this phenomenon is unavoidable. Humans learn by trial and error, by observing things around them and taking note. We then by nature share this information with other humans so that we may all benefit as a species and get more and more intelligent. That is how we have become the intellectual society we are today, with inventions that were not conceivable in the minds of our ancestors. But this is a discussion on video games, so let's not get into that too much. Instead, let's look at one of the most prominent examples of a continuously solved meta, World of Warcraft. Metas are very common in MMORPGs because they are games that usually have an addictive, time-intensive formula of gameplay. If you are spending that much time in one game to accomplish whatever goal it is that you are looking to accomplish, you naturally are going to want to find a way to make that time worth it or get to the goal faster. And if the gameplay is fun but repetitive, you would want a way to condense that down as much as possible to get the most fun in the shortest amount of time. Once that gameplay element is no longer fun, you would naturally want to go on to the next part of the gameplay as quickly as possible. Essentially, you are looking for gratification, and the meta allows you to reach all gratifying experiences in an MMO much faster than if you were trying to figure it out on your own. This doesn't necessarily mean the game would be more or less gratifying if you chose to follow the meta or not. It simply means it would take less time if you do. World of Warcraft is a perfect example for understanding how a meta affects your game in both positive and negative ways. The game has been out for so long that it is extremely hard to find experiences that are not already solved for you. And if a new expansion comes out, or even a new patch, there are people who data mine the patch notes to make sure that we are all aware of what's coming out before it even hits the server. It's also a game that caters to max level, high intensity, time consuming content, which breeds a community that is actually toxic to players who aren't performing at peak efficiency. In fact, it's become completely normalized to have max level dungeon groups or raiding teams that will completely ignore players who aren't using the meta class or talent build. Personally, I have only raided in the last expansion with 2 characters, and both of them are using the meta builds for their classes. However, the character I like to play, that I have been leveling up since 2007, is a Feral Druid. This character isn't even up to max level anymore, because I don't have any prospect of using him as a Feral Druid in max level content. At the time when I was playing World of Warcraft enough to raid and run max level dungeons, the Feral Druid was at the bottom of the DPS totem pole, so I changed the character I was playing to fit the meta and perform on my raiding team. World of Warcraft definitely has a problem with community metagaming, which is only made worse by add-ons that can measure your performance in quantifiable numbers. DPS meters, healing meters, boss alerts, and Raider.io scoring systems are all examples of how community-made add-ons are now forcing players to adopt a meta-driven gameplay style. But it sounds like the meta is all bad news in World of Warcraft. Yet there is an argument the other way. As a player, you cannot avoid the fact that there is a meta, and one will always form whether you like it or not. So as a new player, coming into a game with no prior exposure to any game features or mechanics, you may need to look to strategy guides to help you access the endgame content on an equal playing field with veterans of the game. While the meta can create a player base that requires you to perform at this level that is unattainable by certain playstyles, it can also increase accessibility to players that would otherwise not understand how to perform at that level in the first place. In World of Warcraft, the problem isn't necessarily that there is a meta, but more so that players are driven to the meta to solve other problems. The gameplay in World of Warcraft has over time created a community that relies so much on efficient and effective strategy to get through any of the content. Eventually, it got to the point that creating an efficient or effective way to play was the only way to complete any of the content. Players who wanted to get away from the monotonous grinds or unappealing leveling content would find the only way to make that content last the least amount of time. Go to Icy Veins or Wowhead and follow a guide. So how does the meta affect an individual? How are you affected by another player's choice to follow the meta?
Hell!
The meta can be good and it can be bad for a game, but there is one thing that is certain. It takes player choice and attaches an amount of effectiveness or efficiency to it. That means even if you wanted to play in a way that makes you happy, you could be consciously making the decision to play less effectively.
Hell!
And for some people, that's okay. They can go on in a game choosing their own enjoyment over being effective. But for the overall population of the game, it means that there is this constant pressure to play a specific way. It could lead to an exclusion of players who don't play the meta. Non-meta players would be left out of content simply because the game doesn't allow for their playstyle to be as effective as another. You are affected by the meta whether you are aware of its existence or not. If the developers create a game that caters to the meta, you are more likely to be pressured into playing a certain way. Player agency ends up out the window to make way for effectiveness and efficiency. You may choose to learn everything on your own, to go through a game without any prior knowledge or looking up any guides. But the minute you are involved in group content and you are performing far under the generally accepted skill level of the game, you are going to feel the pressure of the meta creep in. This is another reason why MMORPGs have such an issue with metagaming.
Hell!
The social aspect of the game means that you are constantly being compared to other players. This could be other players telling you that you are not performing as well as someone else, or your own opinion of how you are playing compared to that random guy in your dungeon group. Regardless if it's external or internal, your gameplay is constantly under scrutiny. Like I've said before, the meta isn't something you can get rid of. It's more of a byproduct of having a challenge that multiple players over time are going to attempt to overcome. Eventually, people will share the best strategy to overcome the challenge. That doesn't mean there aren't ways to mitigate the negatives of having a meta. In the example of World of Warcraft, I mentioned that the issue of having a meta was only because it was seen as a solution to get through unappealing content, or to be able to keep up with a community hell-bent on getting to the top of DPS meters. I would say that the best thing developers can do is provide a game that doesn't force players to take part in content they don't want to take part in. Provide options so that the time they spend in the game is worth it without having to skip everything and get to the parts of the game they enjoy. Don't put all your good content at the end and have all that endgame content locked behind tedious progression systems, especially if they are purposely time-gated to artificially drive player engagement statistics. All this does is drive a player to find the most efficient and effective way to complete all that content they don't need to in order to take part in the content they want to. As for you, the best way to mitigate the pressure of a meta on yourself is to play with people who share your playstyle.
Hell!
If you are a role player, there is a community for that. If you just want to find the most decorative gear and try to dress your character the coolest, there is a community for that. If you want to embrace the meta and do intense high difficulty content, there is a community for that. It may take an extra step to get involved, but I guarantee you the game will be so much more enjoyable. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the video or found what I said to be interesting, consider dropping a like on the video and subscribing. I appreciate your support and I can't wait to see what we talk about next.